The morning rain had finally stopped, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet earth and blooming jasmine. I sat in my kitchen, watching droplets slide down the window while my coffee grew cold in my hands. 23 years of marriage, and I still felt this inexplicable urge to check on the garden at our second house after every storm. Marcellus always said I worried too much about those roses, but they were descendants of my grandmother's prize-winning varieties. Some things deserve protection, even if others can't understand why. I didn't tell Marcellus I was driving out to Willowbrook that Tuesday afternoon. He was buried in quarterly reports for his accounting firm, glasses perched on his nose, completely absorbed in columns of numbers that somehow made sense to him. We'd learned over the years to give each other space for our individual pursuits. He had his work, his golf on Saturdays, his monthly poker games with college friends. I had my gardens, my book club, my volunteer work at the Children's Hospital. It was a comfortable arrangement, the kind of measured independence that comes with middle age and mutual respect. The drive to our second house took 45 minutes through winding country roads lined with oak trees that formed natural archways overhead. We'd bought the property 8 years ago, a modest 2-bedroom cottage on 3 acres, thinking it would be our retirement retreat. The realtor had called it a charming fixer-upper with tremendous potential, which in real estate speak meant it needed everything from new plumbing to a complete roof replacement. But the land was perfect, gently sloping toward a small creek with enough southern exposure for the elaborate gardens I'd dreamed of creating. Marcellus had been skeptical at first. "Evangelina, we already have a perfectly good house. Why do we need another project?" But he'd seen how my eyes lit up when I talked about transforming the overgrown yard into something beautiful, something that would outlast us both. He'd signed the papers without complaint, trusting my vision even when he couldn't quite share it. I'd spent countless weekends over the past 8 years developing those gardens. The rose bed along the eastern fence contained varieties I'd propagated from cuttings my grandmother had given me decades ago. The herb spiral near the kitchen window hosted basil, thyme, and rosemary that I harvested for our meals. The wildflower meadow in the back corner attracted butterflies and hummingbirds, creating a natural sanctuary that felt almost sacred in its peaceful beauty. As I turned onto Maple Ridge Road, the familiar anticipation settled in my chest. This feeling never got old, this moment of approaching something I'd created with my own hands. The cottage came into view through a break in the trees, its pale yellow siding bright against the dark green backdrop of surrounding forest. Everything looked exactly as it should from a distance. The mailbox stood straight. The gravel driveway showed no signs of washout from the recent rains, and the old oak tree in the front yard still held the rope swing Marcellus had hung for our nephew's visits. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, enjoying the sight of my domain. The front porch held 2 rocking chairs I'd painted sky blue last spring, and hanging baskets of trailing petunias added splashes of purple and white against the cottage's cheerful exterior. This place represented something important to me, though I'd never been able to articulate exactly what. Perhaps it was the satisfaction of creating beauty from neglect, or maybe it was simply the peace that came from having a corner of the world that existed entirely according to my preferences. I grabbed my gardening gloves from the passenger seat and walked around to the side of the house where the rose garden commanded the best view of the creek. The recent storm had been generous but not destructive. A few broken branches needed clearing, and the mulch had scattered in places. But overall, my plants had weathered the weather beautifully. The knockout roses along the fence were already showing new growth, their stems reaching eagerly toward the afternoon sun. I was bent over, examining a particularly promising bud on my grandmother's climbing rose, when I heard voices coming from the front porch. My first thought was confusion rather than alarm. Neighbors sometimes stopped by to chat about shared property lines or to ask advice about their own gardens. Mrs. Hensley from down the road occasionally brought her grandchildren to see the butterfly garden, always asking permission first and keeping the little ones from picking the flowers. But as I straightened up and listened more carefully, I realized these weren't familiar voices. A woman was speaking in animated tones, the kind of comfortable conversation that suggests intimacy rather than casual neighborliness. And underneath her voice, I could hear the higher pitch of a child's chatter, excited and persistent in the way children get when they're sharing something important with a beloved adult. I walked quietly toward the front of the house, staying close to the wall where the climbing hydrangeas would provide some cover. What I saw when I reached the corner made my breath catch in my throat. A woman sat in one of my rocking chairs, her dark hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, wearing a sundress that looked both expensive and effortlessly elegant. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with the kind of natural beauty that doesn't require much enhancement. In her lap sat a little boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with sandy brown hair and bright green eyes that sparkled with mischief. The scene would have been perfectly ordinary, even charming, except for one crucial detail. I had no idea who these people were. The woman was reading to the child from a picture book, her voice animated as she gave different characters distinct voices and inflections. The little boy giggled at her theatrical renditions, occasionally interrupting to ask questions or point out details in the illustrations. They looked completely at home, as if sitting on this porch was the most natural thing in the world. I stood frozen for several seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. Had I somehow confused the address? But no, this was definitely our cottage. I recognized every detail, from the specific shade of blue I'd chosen for the porch chairs to the hanging baskets I'd arranged just 2 weeks ago. Besides, I'd been coming here regularly for 8 years. I could find this place blindfolded. Perhaps they were lost. Maybe their car had broken down and they'd sought shelter on our porch while waiting for help. But they didn't look distressed or uncertain. They looked settled, comfortable, like they belonged exactly where they were. Taking a deep breath, I stepped around the corner and approached the porch with what I hoped was a friendly but questioning expression. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice light and non-threatening. "Can I help you with something?" The woman looked up from the book, her expression shifting from surprise to something I couldn't quite identify. Wariness, perhaps, or maybe just the natural caution of someone discovering an unexpected stranger on what she clearly considered familiar territory. "Oh," she said, closing the book but keeping her arm around the little boy. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear a car pull up. Are you looking for someone?" Her tone was polite, but slightly protective, the way you might speak to an unexpected visitor when you're not sure of their intentions. The little boy studied me with frank curiosity, the way children do when adults are having conversations they don't quite understand. I was just checking on the property after the storm, I said carefully, still trying to understand the situation, making sure everything was okay with the gardens and the house. The woman's expression grew more puzzled. I'm sorry, but who are you exactly? This is private property. Something cold settled in my stomach. The way she said private property carried an authority that suggested she had every right to challenge my presence here. But that was impossible. This was my house, my property, my garden that I'd spent 8 years developing with my own hands. I think there might be some confusion, I said, forcing my voice to remain calm. This is my house. My husband and I own this property. The woman's eyebrows rose, and she unconsciously tightened her hold on the child. Your house? I'm sorry, but that can't be right. My husband owns this property. I'm Cordelia Ashworth, and this is our weekend retreat. The name meant nothing to me, but the confidence in her voice was unmistakable. She wasn't lying or confused. She genuinely believed what she was saying. There must be some mistake, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I felt a creeping uncertainty. My name is Evangelina Thornfield. My husband Marcellus and I bought this cottage 8 years ago. Cordelia's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching concern. Mrs. Thornfield, I think you might have the wrong address. This property belongs to my husband, Marcellus Ashworth. We've owned it for several years now. The world seemed to tilt slightly. She'd said, Marcellus, my husband's name, spoken with the same casual familiarity I would use, but her last name was different, and she was calling him her husband. Did you say Marcellus? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, she replied, studying my face with growing concern. Marcellus Ashworth. He's my husband, and this is our son, Timothy. I looked at the little boy more carefully, and my heart stuttered. Those green eyes weren't just bright and mischievous. They were familiar. I'd seen those exact eyes looking back at me from photographs of Marcellus as a child. The shape of the nose, the way his hair fell across his forehead, even the way he tilted his head when he was thinking. It was all achingly, impossibly familiar. I think I should go, I managed to say, backing away from the porch. I must have gotten the wrong address. Cordelia stood up, still holding the child, but looking genuinely worried now. Are you okay? You look pale. Would you like me to call someone? No, I'm fine, I lied, continuing to retreat toward my car. Just a silly mistake. Sorry to have bothered you. I made it to my car on unsteady legs, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. In my rearview mirror, I could see Cordelia standing on the porch, watching me leave with an expression of concern and confusion. The little boy had resumed his position in the rocking chair, apparently untroubled by the strange encounter. The drive home passed in a blur of disjointed thoughts and rising panic. Every rational explanation I tried to construct crumbled under the weight of what I'd witnessed. There was no mistake about the property. I knew every inch of that land, every plant in those gardens, every board in that porch where I'd spent countless peaceful afternoons. And there was no mistake about the child's resemblance to my husband. By the time I pulled into our driveway, my hands had stopped shaking, but my mind was racing with possibilities I didn't want to consider. Marcellus's car was in its usual spot, and I could see light from his office window. He was probably still working on those quarterly reports, completely absorbed in his numbers, unaware that his wife had just encountered a reality that didn't match anything in her understanding of their shared life. I sat in the car for several minutes, trying to gather my thoughts before going inside. How do you ask your husband of 23 years if he has another wife and child? How do you begin a conversation that might destroy everything you've believed about your marriage, your life, your very identity as someone who knows and is known? The front door opened and Marcellus appeared, probably wondering why I was sitting in the driveway instead of coming inside. He looked exactly as he had when I'd left that morning. Rumpled shirt, reading glasses pushed up on his head, the slightly distracted expression he wore when he was deep in concentration. He looked like my husband, the man I'd shared a bed with for over 2 decades, the man who knew my coffee preference and remembered to buy my favorite flowers on ordinary Tuesdays. "Everything okay out there?" he called, walking toward the car with a smile that seemed completely genuine. "You look like you've seen a ghost." If only it were that simple, I thought. Ghosts, at least, were safely dead and couldn't complicate your present with their impossible existence. "Just tired?" I said, getting out of the car and forcing myself to meet his eyes. "Long drive, and I think I might be coming down with something." He reached out to feel my forehead, a gesture so automatic and caring that it made my chest ache. "You do feel a little warm. Why don't you go lie down? I can make dinner tonight." Such a normal offer, such an ordinary moment of marital consideration. Standing there in our driveway, surrounded by the familiar landscape of our neighborhood, it was easy to believe that the afternoon's encounter had been some sort of stress-induced hallucination. Perhaps I'd been working too hard in the gardens, spending too much time in the sun. Perhaps my subconscious had created an elaborate fantasy based on some random strangers who'd wandered onto our property. But even as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, I couldn't forget the certainty in Cordelia's voice when she'd claimed the cottage as her own, or the unmistakable resemblance between little Timothy and the photographs of Marcellus's childhood that sat on our bedroom dresser. "Actually, I think I'll take a shower first," I said, needing time to think without Marcellus's concerned attention. "Give me an hour, and then we can figure out dinner together?" He nodded and headed back toward his office, already reaching for his phone to check messages. Such a typical Marcellus response, acknowledging my needs while seamlessly returning to his own preoccupations. In 23 years of marriage, I'd learned to appreciate his ability to give me space when I needed it, never pushing for explanations or emotional processing until I was ready to share. Under the hot spray of the shower, I tried to organize my thoughts logically. There had to be an explanation that didn't involve my husband living a double life. Perhaps Cordelia was confused about the property ownership. Perhaps she was renting the cottage from someone who'd fraudulently claimed to own it. Perhaps the resemblance between Timothy and Marcellus was coincidental, the kind of random genetic lottery that sometimes produces startling similarities between unrelated people. But even as I constructed these alternative explanations, I found myself remembering things that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried new weight. Marcellus's business trips that seemed longer than they needed to be, his habit of taking phone calls in his office with the door closed, the way he sometimes seemed distracted on weekends, as if part of his attention was somewhere else entirely. I'd always attributed these behaviors to work stress and middle-aged preoccupation. Marcellus was a successful accountant with demanding clients and complex financial situations to manage. Of course, he needed privacy for sensitive business conversations. Of course, he sometimes seemed mentally elsewhere during his downtime. He carried a lot of responsibility. But what if those business trips included stops I didn't know about? What if those private phone calls weren't entirely professional? What if his weekend distraction stemmed from thinking about another family, another life, another version of himself that existed parallel to the one I knew? I stood under the water until it ran cold, but the clarity I'd hoped for didn't come. Instead, I felt increasingly uncertain about everything I'd taken for granted. How well did I really know my husband? How much of his life existed outside my awareness? How many assumptions had I made about our relationship that might prove to be built on incomplete information? When I finally emerged from the bathroom, I could hear Marcellus moving around in the kitchen, probably starting dinner preparations as he'd promised. The domestic sounds should have been comforting. The familiar rhythm of cabinet doors opening and closing, the whistle of the kettle, the soft jazz music he always played while cooking. Instead, they felt surreal, like a performance of normalcy that might be covering something I couldn't yet comprehend. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel confident and attractive. If I was going to have a difficult conversation with my husband, I wanted to feel as much like myself as possible. The face in the mirror looked familiar, but somehow vulnerable, as if the afternoon's discoveries had aged me in ways that went beyond the simple passage of time. Downstairs, Marcellus was indeed cooking, standing at the stove with his sleeves rolled up, stirring something that smelled like the pasta sauce he'd perfected over years of experimentation. He looked up when I entered the kitchen, his expression brightening in a way that seemed completely natural. "Feeling better?" he asked, reaching for a wooden spoon to offer me a taste of the sauce. I added a little more oregano this time. "Tell me what you think." I tasted the sauce automatically, my mind elsewhere. "It's good," I said, though I barely registered the flavor. "Marcellus, can we talk about something?" Something in my tone must have alerted him to the seriousness of my request, because he immediately turned down the heat under the pot and gave me his full attention. "Of course. What's on your mind? How do you begin such a conversation? How do you voice suspicions that sound paranoid even in your own head?" I searched for words that would open this discussion without immediately putting him on the defensive. "I went out to the cottage today," I said carefully, watching his face for any change in expression, "to check on the gardens after the storm." "How did everything look?" he asked, and if there was any tension in his voice, it was subtle enough that I might have been imagining it. "The gardens were fine," I continued, still studying his face, "but there were people there, a woman and a little boy. They seemed very comfortable, like they belonged there." Marcellus frowned, but it appeared to be simple confusion rather than alarm. "That's odd. Did they say what they were doing on our property?" "That's the strange part," I said, taking a deep breath. "The woman claimed to own the cottage. She said her husband owned it and that it was their weekend retreat. Well, that's obviously impossible," Marcellus said with a slight laugh. "We have the deed. The property is clearly ours. She must have been confused, or maybe she was thinking of a different cottage. There are several similar ones in that area." His response sounded perfectly reasonable, exactly what an innocent husband would say when told about trespassers on his property. But something in his demeanor seemed just slightly off, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what was triggering my unease. "She mentioned her husband's name," I said quietly, watching his reaction carefully. "She said her husband was named Martellus." For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, recognition, or maybe just confusion about the coincidence. It was gone so quickly that I almost thought I'd imagined it. Marcellus isn't that uncommon a name, he said, though his voice had lost some of its casual confidence. It's probably just a coincidence. Did you explain that you were the actual owner? I tried to, I said, but she seemed very certain about her claim. And Marcellus, there's something else. The little boy with her, he looked familiar. He had your eyes, your nose, even the way you used to wear your hair as a child. This time, there was no mistaking his reaction. The color drained from his face, and he gripped the edge of the counter as if he needed the support. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The pasta sauce bubbled quietly on the stove, filling the silence with its gentle simmer. "Evangelina," he finally said, his voice careful and measured, "I think we need to sit down and have a serious conversation." The way he said it told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't going to be a discussion about confused trespassers or coincidental resemblances. This was going to be the kind of conversation that divided life into before and after, the kind that changed everything permanently and irrevocably. We sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals over the years, where we'd discussed vacation plans and household budgets and the small daily concerns that make up a shared life. Now, it felt like a courtroom, with Marcellus in the defendant's chair and me as both prosecutor and jury. He sat across from me, his hands folded in front of him, staring down at the wood grain as if it might offer him guidance for whatever he was about to say. The confident, slightly distracted man who'd greeted me in the driveway had been replaced by someone who looked older, more fragile, burdened by secrets he could no longer carry alone. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly, still not meeting my eyes. The question hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't a denial or an explanation or even an apology. It was a confession wrapped in a question, an acknowledgement that there was indeed something to know. "I don't know anything yet," I said, though my voice was steadier than I felt. "I only know what I saw today. A woman who claims to be married to you and a little boy who looks like he could be your son." Marcellus finally looked up, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before. Not just guilt, but a deep, weary sadness that seemed to have been building for years. "Her name is Cordelia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and Timothy is my son." The words hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. Even though I'd begun to suspect this truth, hearing him say it out loud felt like being hit by a truck. 23 years of marriage, and my husband had another wife, another child, another life that existed entirely separate from our own. "How long?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded when everything inside me was screaming. "Timothy will be 5 next month," he said, which answered my question without him having to do the math out loud. At least 5 years of deception, 5 years of living a double life while I remained completely unaware. "And the woman, Cordelia, how long have you been married to her?" Marcellus winced at the word married, and I realized with growing horror that this betrayal might be even more complex than I'd imagined. "We're not legally married," he said quickly, as if this distinction might somehow lessen the impact. "You're my legal wife, Evangelina. You always have been. But to Cordelia, to Timothy, I'm Marcellus Ashworth. I have a different identity, a different life. They think I'm divorced, that I travel for work, that they're my only family." The enormity of the deception began to sink in. This wasn't just an affair or even a second relationship. This was an entirely fabricated existence, complete with false identity and elaborate lies told to multiple people over multiple years. The cottage? I said, pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. She wasn't confused about owning it. You've been bringing them there. He nodded miserably. I bought it for them, using a different name, different documents. Cordelia thinks it's our weekend retreat, our special place away from the city where I supposedly work. What city? I asked, though I was beginning to understand the scope of his double life. Chicago, he said. I told her I'm an investment advisor there, that I travel back and forth for clients. She thinks that's why I'm only available on certain days, why I can't always answer my phone immediately. I stared at him, trying to process the level of planning and deception this arrangement would have required. Bank accounts, fake identification, elaborate scheduling to keep two families from ever intersecting. It was like something from a movie, except it was my life being torn apart by the revelation. Why? I finally asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Marcellus was quiet for a long time, struggling with how to explain the inexplicable. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a pain that seemed to surprise even him. I met her at a conference in Chicago 6 years ago. She was working registration just out of college, trying to figure out her life. She was so young, so full of hope and enthusiasm about everything. When I was with her, I felt like a different person, younger, more interesting, like I still had possibilities instead of just responsibilities. The explanation was both predictable and heartbreaking. A midlife crisis that had spiraled into something far more complicated than a simple affair. But that didn't explain the child, the false identity, the elaborate deception that had sustained this double life for years. And Timothy? I asked. That wasn't planned, he said quickly. Cordelia got pregnant about a year into our relationship. She wanted to get married, wanted us to build a life together. I should have told her the truth then, should have ended everything. But I couldn't bear to break her heart. And when Timothy was born, he trailed off, but I could see the emotion in his face. Whatever else this child represented, Marcellus loved him. That was perhaps the most painful part of all, knowing that my husband's betrayal had produced something precious to him, something that connected him to this other life in ways that went beyond mere deception. So you created Marcellus Ashworth, I said, the pieces falling into place. You made yourself divorced instead of married, available instead of committed. You gave them a version of yourself that could be completely theirs. I never meant for it to go this far, he said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. I kept thinking I would find a way to end it, to extract myself without destroying Cordelia and Timothy. But every time I tried to pull back, to create some distance, I'd see Timothy's face, or Cordelia would talk about our future together, and I couldn't bring myself to take away everything they believed about their lives. I understood now why he'd seemed distracted on weekends, why his business trips had grown longer and more frequent, why he sometimes seemed to be living partly elsewhere, even when he was sitting right next to me. He had been living elsewhere, investing emotional energy and practical resources in maintaining this parallel existence. The cottage? I said again, thinking about all the time I'd spent there, all the care I'd put into those gardens. How long have you been bringing them there? About 3 years, he admitted. I thought it was safe because you usually called before driving out, and I could make sure they weren't there when you planned to visit. But I didn't call today, I said, understanding finally how this discovery had happened. I just went. He nodded, looking like a man whose carefully constructed world had finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The silence stretched between us, filled with the magnitude of what had been revealed and what it meant for our future. 23 years of marriage, and I was sitting across from a stranger who happened to share my last name and my address, the man I'd thought I knew didn't exist. The life I'd thought we'd built together was only half real, shadowed by another life that was equally real to the people living it. "What happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure which of us I was asking. Marcellus looked at me with an expression of desperate hope, as if I might somehow have an answer that would solve this impossible situation without destroying everyone involved. "I don't know," he said, and for the first time since this conversation began, I believed he was telling me the complete truth. We sat in that heavy silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The pasta sauce had begun to stick to the bottom of the pot, filling the kitchen with the acrid smell of something burning. Marcellus got up automatically to turn off the heat, his movements mechanical and distant. When he sat back down, he looked like a man who had aged a decade in the space of our conversation. "How could you do this?" I asked, the question emerging from somewhere deep and raw. "Not just the affair, Marcellus. I could maybe understand that, but creating an entire false identity, letting them believe in a life that doesn't exist, letting me believe in a marriage that was only half real." He flinched at each accusation but didn't try to defend himself. "I know how it sounds. I know there's no excuse for what I've done." "Then why?" I pressed. "Help me understand how the man I've been married to for 23 years could live such an elaborate lie." Marcellus rubbed his face with both hands, leaving red marks on his cheeks. "When I met Cordelia, I felt like I was disappearing. Not in our marriage specifically, but in my life. I was 41 years old, working 60-hour weeks, watching my hairline recede and my waistline expand. I felt like I'd already lived all the interesting parts of my life, like everything ahead was just a slow decline toward retirement and irrelevance. I wanted to interrupt, to point out that we'd had good years together, meaningful experiences, a partnership that had sustained us through various challenges. But I forced myself to listen, to try to understand how he justified such massive deception. Cordelia made me feel like I was still capable of being someone's first choice, someone's great love story. When I was with her, I wasn't just Marcellus the accountant who'd settled into middle-aged routine. I was this mysterious man with an important job in Chicago, someone whose time was valuable and whose attention was precious because it was limited. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd felt more valued in a relationship built on lies than in one built on 2 decades of shared reality. "And when she got pregnant?" I asked. "That changed everything," he said, his voice dropping. Suddenly it wasn't just about how I felt or what I wanted. There was going to be a child who would need a father, and Cordelia was so excited about our future together. She'd already started planning our wedding, talking about names for the baby, imagining this whole life we were going to build. "So you built it," I said quietly. "You became Marcellus Ashworth and gave them the life she was imagining." I told myself it was temporary, he said, though even he seemed to recognize how weak that sounded. I thought I could figure out a way to transition out of both relationships gradually, maybe move somewhere completely new and start over. But then Timothy was born, and he was so perfect, so completely mine. And Cordelia was such a devoted mother, so grateful for the family we'd created together. I could see it all now. the snowball effect of deception, each lie requiring additional lies to maintain, each moment of happiness in his secret life making it harder to destroy what he'd built there. It was a trap of his own making, but a trap nonetheless. "What about me?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "What about our marriage, our life together? How did you justify lying to me every single day for 5 years?" Marcellus met my eyes for the first time since his confession began. "I convinced myself I was protecting you, that if you never knew, you wouldn't be hurt. I thought I could maintain both lives indefinitely, that everyone could be happy as long as no one knew about the others. But that was never sustainable," I pointed out. "Eventually, something like today was bound to happen." "I know that now," he said. "I think I always knew it, but I kept pushing that knowledge away. It was easier to focus on immediate problems, scheduling conflicts, making sure phone calls didn't overlap, keeping track of which stories I'd told to whom. The more he explained, the more I understood the exhausting complexity of what he'd been maintaining: 2 different personas, 2 sets of obligations, 2 emotional lives that required constant attention and care. No wonder he'd seemed distracted lately. The real mystery was how he'd managed to keep it all straight for as long as he had. "Do you love her?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Marcellus was quiet for a long time, considering the question seriously. "I love who I am when I'm with her," he finally said. "I love the life we've built together, the family we've created, but Evangelina, that doesn't mean I don't love you too. What we have is different, deeper in some ways. It's built on actual history, real partnership. What I have with Cordelia is based on a fantasy version of myself. It was a distinction that might have mattered more if he hadn't spent 5 years nurturing that fantasy at the expense of our reality." "And Timothy?" I asked. This time, his face softened in a way that answered the question before he spoke. "He's my son. I know that complicates everything, but I can't just stop being his father. He calls me Daddy. He waits for me to come home on weekends. He has my eyes, my stubborn streak, my weird sense of humor about knock-knock jokes." I could hear the love in his voice, and it broke my heart in a completely unexpected way. This wasn't just about infidelity or deception. There was a child involved now, an innocent little boy who had never asked to be part of this complicated situation. "Does he know about me?" I asked. "No," Marcellus said quickly. "As far as Timothy knows, I work in Chicago and come home to their cottage on weekends. Cordelia thinks I travel for business during the week, that my work requires me to be away from home regularly." "And your work? Your actual job here?" I asked, realizing I didn't understand how he'd managed the practical aspects of maintaining 2 lives. "I've been working more remotely than you realized," he admitted. "I told my clients I was expanding to serve Chicago area customers, which justified longer trips and more flexible scheduling. Most of my work can be done from anywhere with a good internet connection. The planning involved was staggering. He'd essentially restructured his entire professional life to accommodate his deception, finding ways to be physically present for both families while maintaining the illusion that each was his primary commitment." We were interrupted by the sound of my phone ringing. The caller ID showed my sister Magnolia's name, and I realized with a start that it was Thursday evening. Magnolia and I had talked every Thursday for the past 15 years, a tradition that had started when our mother died, and we'd both felt the need for more regular contact. I should take this, I said, grateful for the interruption. She'll worry if I don't answer. Evangelina? Magnolia's voice was bright and cheerful, completely unaware that she was calling into the middle of a life-altering crisis. How was your day? Did you get out to check on the cottage after all that rain? The question hit me like a physical blow. How was I supposed to answer that? How could I possibly explain that my day had included discovering my husband's secret family? It was fine, I managed to say. Everything looked good. That's wonderful. I know how you worry about those roses of yours. Did Marcellus go with you, or did you make the trip solo? I glanced at Marcellus, who was watching me with an expression of concern and guilt. Solo, I said. Marcellus was busy with work. That man and his spreadsheets, Magnolia said with affectionate exasperation. I swear, sometimes I think you married an accountant because you knew he'd never surprise you with anything spontaneous. If only she knew, I thought. If only any of us had known what Marcellus was capable of when it came to spontaneous decisions and surprising complications. Listen, Maggie, can I call you back tomorrow? I asked, using her childhood nickname. I'm in the middle of something right now. Of course, honey. Everything okay? You sound a little stressed. Just tired, I lied. Long day, and I think I might be coming down with something. Get some rest then, and make sure that husband of yours takes care of you. That's what spouses are for. After I hung up, the silence in our kitchen felt even heavier than before. Magnolia's casual assumptions about marriage and spousal care highlighted how fundamentally my understanding of my own relationship had been shattered. What are you going to do? Marcellus asked quietly. It was the question I'd been dreading because I truly didn't know. 23 years of marriage didn't just disappear because of betrayal. Even betrayal this massive. But I also couldn't imagine how we could move forward with this knowledge between us. I don't know yet, I said honestly. I need time to think, to process what this means. Should I stay somewhere else tonight? He asked, and I could hear the hope in his voice that I might say no. Yes, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my answer. I need space to figure out what I'm feeling without you sitting across from me looking guilty and apologetic. He nodded, though I could see the disappointment in his expression. I'll go to the office. I have a fold-out couch there for when I work late. As he gathered a few things from upstairs, I sat alone in our kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the normal evening we'd started to have before everything changed. The pasta sauce was ruined, but somehow that seemed fitting. Nothing about this day could be salvaged or returned to its original state. When Marcellus came back downstairs with a small overnight bag, he paused by the kitchen door. Evangelina, I want you to know that everything good between us has been real. Our marriage, our partnership, the love we've shared, that wasn't a lie. Even if I've been living one. I looked at him standing there, this man who'd shared my bed and my life for over 2 decades, and realized I no longer knew how to separate the truth from the deception. Maybe he was right, that our marriage had been real for him. But how could I trust that assessment when he had proven himself capable of such elaborate dishonesty? I'll call you tomorrow, he said when I didn't respond. After you've had time to think. After he left, I sat in the gathering darkness of our kitchen, not bothering to turn on lights as evening settled around me. The house felt different somehow, less like home, and more like a stage set for a life that might or might not be authentic. How many evenings had we spent in this kitchen talking about our days, planning our weekends, discussing the small concerns and celebrations that make up a marriage, and how many of those conversations had been shadowed by his secret life, I tried to remember signs I might have missed, clues that could have alerted me to what was happening. But the truth was, Marcellus had been careful. The business trips weren't dramatically more frequent than they'd been in previous years. His distraction could easily be attributed to work stress. His phone habits hadn't changed in ways that seemed suspicious. He'd been living a double life, but he'd been good at it. That night, I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine what came next. Divorce seemed like the obvious answer, but 23 years of shared life couldn't be untangled easily. We owned property together, had intertwined finances, shared friends who would be shocked by this revelation. More importantly, we had history together. Good history, meaningful experiences, a partnership that had sustained us through various challenges over the years. But there was also Timothy to consider now. A little boy who believed Marcellus was his father, who waited for weekend visits, who had never asked to be part of this complicated situation. Whatever decisions I made would affect not just Marcellus and me, but an innocent child, and a woman who'd been deceived as much as I had been. By morning, I hadn't slept more than a few hours, but I'd reached some clarity about what I needed to do next. I couldn't make decisions about my marriage without understanding the full scope of what Marcellus had created. I needed to see Cordelia again, to talk to her honestly about what had been done to both of us. I called Marcellus around 9 in the morning. He answered on the first ring, his voice heavy with exhaustion and hope. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Confused," I said honestly, "but I've decided what I need to do next. I want to talk to Cordelia." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. "Evangelina, I don't think that's a good idea," he finally said. "It would destroy her world, destroy Timothy's sense of security. Can't we work through this between ourselves?" "No," I said firmly. "She deserves to know the truth, just like I deserve to know it. You've been making decisions for all of us without our consent for 5 years. That ends now." "But Timothy deserves to have the adults in his life tell him the truth in age-appropriate ways, rather than continuing to build his sense of family on lies that will eventually crumble anyway." I could hear Marcellus breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "What are you going to tell her?" "The truth," I said. "That you're married to me, that you've been lying to both of us, and that we need to figure out how to move forward in a way that protects Timothy while acknowledging reality." "She's going to hate me," he said quietly. "Probably," I agreed. "But she's going to hate you more if she finds out from someone else, or if Timothy grows up and discovers that his childhood was built on deception." After we hung up, I drove back to the cottage, my heart pounding with nervousness about the conversation I was about to have. I had no idea how Cordelia would react to learning that her husband was actually someone else's husband, that their entire relationship was based on an elaborate lie. I found her in the garden, behind the cottage, playing with Timothy, while he chased butterflies among the wildflowers I'd planted 3 years ago. She was wearing jeans and a simple white t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, looking young and carefree and completely unprepared for what I was about to tell her. Timothy saw me first and waved shyly, the way children do when they recognize someone but can't quite place them in context. "Mrs. Thornfield?" Cordelia said, standing up and brushing dirt from her knees. "I wasn't expecting to see you again. Did you figure out the confusion about the address?" "Actually," I said carefully, "I think we need to talk. About the confusion and about your husband." Something in my tone must have alerted her to the seriousness of the situation, because her expression immediately became more guarded. "Timothy, sweetie," she called to the little boy, "why don't you go inside and get your coloring books? The grown-ups need to have a conversation." He ran toward the cottage with the boundless energy of a 4-year-old, completely unaware that the adults around him were about to discuss something that would change his understanding of his family. When we were alone, Cordelia faced me with the wariness of someone who senses approaching bad news but doesn't yet know what form it will take. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm not sure what this is about, but if you're having some kind of property dispute with my husband, I think you should probably discuss it with him directly." "There's no property dispute," I said gently, "but there is something you need to know about your husband. About Marcellus." I took a deep breath, knowing that the next words would shatter her sense of reality as completely as mine had been shattered the day before. "Cordelia, I'm married to Marcellus. I have been for 23 years. His real name is Marcellus Thornfield, not Ashworth. He doesn't work in Chicago, and he's not divorced. We live together about an hour from here, and I had no idea you or Timothy existed until yesterday." The color drained from her face so quickly that I instinctively stepped forward, afraid she might faint. "That's not possible," she whispered, though I could see in her eyes that she was already beginning to believe it. "Marcellus would never. He's not the kind of man who would lie about something like that." "I know how this sounds," I said softly. "I know it's impossible to accept, but yesterday, when I found you here, you said your husband's name was Marcellus. That's when I began to understand what had been happening." Cordelia sank onto one of the benches I'd placed among the rose beds, her hands shaking as she tried to process what I was telling her. "But we've been together for 6 years," she said, her voice barely audible. "We have a son together. We've been planning our future, talking about expanding our family, maybe buying a bigger house." My heart broke for her. Whatever else Marcellus had done, he'd clearly been a devoted partner to her within the bounds of their relationship. She'd had no reason to doubt his sincerity or question his commitment. "Can you prove what you're saying?" she asked, though there was no challenge in her tone, only a desperate hope that I might be wrong. I pulled out my phone and showed her photos from our life together. Wedding pictures, vacation snapshots, recent images from family gatherings. In every photo, Marcellus looked exactly like the man she knew as her husband, just without the mustache he'd apparently grown sometime after meeting her. "He grew the mustache about 4 years ago," I said, noting her recognition of the difference. "Told me he wanted to try a new look." Cordelia stared at the photos, and I watched as her entire understanding of her life crumbled before my eyes. It was painful to witness, even knowing that the truth needed to be told. "Timothy," she said suddenly, panic entering her voice. "Oh God, Timothy, what am I going to tell Timothy?" "We'll figure that out together," I said, sitting beside her on the bench. "All of us, including Marcellus. But first, you need to know that none of this is your fault. You were lied to, just as much as I was." She was crying now, tears of anger and grief and sheer disbelief streaming down her face. 6 years, she repeated. 6 years of my life, and it was all fake. "Your love for Timothy isn't fake," I pointed out gently. "And whatever else is true about Marcellus, his love for both of you appears to be genuine. That doesn't excuse what he's done, but it means Timothy has been truly loved, not just tolerated or manipulated." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us struggling to absorb the magnitude of the deception that had shaped our lives. Finally, Cordelia spoke again. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing the same question I'd posed to Marcellus the night before. I don't know, I admitted, but I think we need to talk to Marcellus together. All three of us need to understand the full truth before we can make decisions about the future. Cordelia nodded slowly. Timothy is napping inside. Could we call him now? I don't think I can wait much longer to have this conversation. I called Marcellus from my cell phone, putting it on speaker so Cordelia could hear both sides of the conversation. Evangelina? He answered immediately. How did it go? Is Cordelia okay? I'm here, Marcellus, Cordelia said, her voice steady despite her tears. And no, I'm not okay. But I need to hear from you what Evangelina just told me. I need to hear you say it. The silence stretched so long that I thought he might have hung up. Cordelia, he finally said, his voice breaking, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant to hurt you. Just tell me the truth, she said firmly. Are you married to someone else? Have you been lying to me for 6 years about who you are? Yes, he whispered. Yes, I have. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Cordelia closed her eyes as if the words were physically painful to hear. Come here, she said. Come to the cottage now. We need to talk about this face to face, and we need to figure out what we're going to tell Timothy. Within an hour, Marcellus arrived at the cottage, looking haggard and defeated. The three of us sat on the front porch while Timothy continued his nap inside, and Marcellus told Cordelia the same story he'd told me the night before. She listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her expression cycling through hurt, anger, and bewilderment. So when you said you had to work late, when you couldn't answer your phone for hours at a time, when you seemed distracted during our time together, she said when he finished, you were with her, with your real wife. You're both real, Marcellus said desperately. Both relationships have been real to me, even if the circumstances were impossible. No, Cordelia said firmly. What we had was real for me, but it was a performance for you. I was in love with someone who doesn't actually exist. The truth of that statement hit all of us like a physical blow. Marcellus had indeed created a character to love Cordelia with. Successful Chicago businessman Marcellus Ashworth, divorced and available, whose complicated schedule was due to professional demands rather than divided loyalties. What about Timothy? Cordelia asked, getting to the heart of what mattered most. Whatever else you've lied about, are you really his father? Do you really love him? Yes, Marcellus said without hesitation. Timothy is my son, and I love him more than I've ever loved anything in my life. That's the one thing that's been completely true throughout all of this. Then we need to figure out how to protect him, Cordelia said, surprising me with her composure. How to help him understand that his family is changing without making him feel responsible or abandoned. Over the next several hours, the three of us had the most difficult conversation of my life. We talked about divorce proceedings, custody arrangements, financial responsibilities, and how to explain to a 4-year-old that his family structure was more complicated than he'd been told. Cordelia proved to be remarkably strong and pragmatic once the initial shock wore off. She'd been hurt and deceived, but her primary concern was Timothy's well-being and ensuring that he maintained a relationship with his father despite the lies that had surrounded his existence. I need time, she told Marcellus, time to figure out who I am without the life I thought we were building together. And I need you to be honest with Timothy and with me from now on, no matter how difficult the truth might be. And I need to decide whether our marriage can survive this, I added, looking directly at Marcellus, whether I can trust you again and whether what we had was worth fighting to rebuild. As the sun began to set, Timothy woke from his nap and joined us on the porch, confused by the presence of the woman he'd met briefly the day before and the serious expressions on all the adult faces. "Daddy, who is she?" he asked, pointing at me with the direct curiosity of childhood. Marcellus looked at Cordelia and me, seeking permission for how to handle this moment. Cordelia nodded slightly, giving him the go-ahead to begin telling Timothy the truth in whatever way seemed appropriate for a 4-year-old's understanding. "Timothy," Marcellus said, lifting his son onto his lap, "this is Evangelina. She's a very important person in Daddy's life, and we need to talk about some changes that are going to happen in our family." It was the beginning of a conversation that would continue for years, I realized. The process of helping Timothy understand his place in a family structure that had never been what it appeared to be would require patience, honesty, and careful attention to his emotional needs. That evening, I drove home alone, leaving Marcellus and Cordelia to continue their own difficult conversations about logistics and emotional boundaries. My house felt different when I walked in. Not necessarily unwelcoming, but foreign somehow, as if I were seeing it with new eyes. Over the next several weeks, Marcellus moved into his office apartment while we all tried to figure out what came next. He and Cordelia worked out a schedule that allowed him to maintain his relationship with Timothy while giving her space to heal from the betrayal. Meanwhile, he and I began the painful process of marriage counseling, trying to determine whether trust could be rebuilt after such massive deception. The counseling sessions were brutal. Dr. Helena Weatherby was a stern woman in her 60s who had no patience for self-pity or justification. She forced us to examine not just Marcellus's choices, but the dynamics in our marriage that might have contributed to his desire to escape into fantasy. "Marcellus," she said during one particularly difficult session, "you've described feeling invisible and unimportant in your regular life. Evangelina, did you have any awareness of your husband feeling this way?" I had to admit that I hadn't. We'd fallen into comfortable routines over the years, taking each other's presence for granted in ways that probably weren't healthy for either of us. But that doesn't excuse creating an entirely false identity, I pointed out. If Marcellus was unhappy, he should have talked to me about it, not run away to play house with someone else. "I'm not excusing anything," Dr. Weatherby said firmly. "I'm trying to help you both understand how you arrived at this point so you can decide whether there's a path forward." The path forward, it turned out, was more complicated than either of us had anticipated. Marcellus was genuinely remorseful and committed to rebuilding trust, but he was also unwilling to abandon Timothy or completely cut ties with Cordelia. He wanted to be part of his son's life, which meant maintaining some form of relationship with the woman he'd deceived for 6 years. "I understand that Timothy needs his father," I told him during one of our sessions, "but I'm not sure I can build a marriage with someone who has ongoing emotional ties to another family." It was an impossible situation with no clean solutions. Whatever we decided would require compromise and ongoing discomfort for everyone involved. The breakthrough came during our 8th counseling session when Dr. Weatherby asked us to imagine our lives 5 years in the future. "Evangelina," she said, "if you divorce Marcellus, what does your future look like?" I thought about it carefully. I'd probably sell our house, maybe move somewhere new where I don't have to see reminders of our life together. I'd focus on my gardens, my volunteer work, maybe travel more than we used to. I'd eventually date again, maybe even remarry if I met the right person. "And would you be happy?" "Maybe," I said honestly. "Different, but maybe happy." "Marcellus, same question. If Evangelina divorces you, What does your future look like? I'd find an apartment near Cordelia and Timothy so I could be more involved in my son's daily life. I'd probably never remarry. I've proven I'm not good at managing one relationship honestly, let alone multiple ones. I'd focus on being the best father I can be and trying to repair some of the damage I've done. And would you be happy? No, he said without hesitation. I'd be grateful for the relationship with Timothy, but I'd spend the rest of my life regretting what I threw away with Evangelina. Dr. Weatherby turned back to me. Now, imagine staying married to Marcellus, working through this betrayal, rebuilding your relationship on more honest foundations. What does that future look like? Difficult, I said immediately. It would take years to trust him completely again, and even then, there would always be this shadow over our marriage. And there would be Timothy, who I'd have to accept as part of Marcellus's life permanently. Could you do that? Accept Timothy as part of your extended family? The question surprised me. Over the weeks since discovering Marcellus's secret life, I'd thought about Timothy often. He was an innocent child caught in an impossible situation, but he was also a daily reminder of my husband's betrayal. I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe. He seems like a sweet little boy, and none of this is his fault. Marcellus, Dr. Weatherby said, if you and Evangelina rebuild your marriage, what role would Cordelia and Timothy play in your life? I want to be a good father to Timothy, he said carefully. That means regular visits, involvement in his important milestones, financial support. As for Cordelia, I hope we can eventually have a cordial co-parenting relationship, but I understand that might take time. And you'd be willing to be completely transparent with Evangelina about all interactions with them? Yes, he said without hesitation. No more secrets, no more lies, no matter how difficult the truth might be. After that session, I spent a week alone in our house, trying to imagine both possible futures. Divorce would be cleaner in some ways, allowing me to start fresh without the complications of Marcellus's ongoing relationship with his son. But it would also mean giving up 23 years of partnership, throwing away everything good we'd built together because of his poor choices. The decision came to me while I was working in my garden, tending to the same roses I'd been worried about on the day this whole crisis began. Marriage, I realized, was like gardening. It required constant attention, occasional pruning, and the ability to weather unexpected storms. But if the roots were strong enough, even badly damaged plants could recover and flourish again. I called Marcellus that evening. I want to try, I told him. I want to see if we can rebuild what we had, but it has to be completely different this time. Complete honesty, no matter how difficult. And I want to meet Timothy properly, maybe develop some kind of relationship with him if that feels right for everyone involved. The relief in his voice was unmistakable. Are you sure? I know I'm asking a lot, expecting you to accept not just my son, but the ongoing complications of co-parenting with Cordelia. I'm not sure of anything, I said honestly, but I'm willing to try if you are. 6 months later, I was sitting in the same garden at the cottage where I'd first discovered Marcellus's secret life, watching Timothy chase butterflies while Cordelia and I planned his 5th birthday party. It wasn't the future any of us had imagined, but it was honest and real, in ways our previous lives hadn't been. Cordelia and I had developed an unlikely friendship based on our shared experience of being deceived and our mutual commitment to Timothy's well-being. She'd started dating again and seemed to be finding her way toward a happiness that didn't depend on the false identity Marcellus had created. Marcellus and I were still in counseling, still rebuilding trust day by day. Our marriage looked nothing like it had before, but it was stronger in some ways for having been tested and chosen rather than simply accepted out of habit. "Evangelina," Timothy called, running toward me with a butterfly net in his hand. "Look what I caught!" He showed me a perfect monarch butterfly, its wings trembling delicately in the mesh of the net. "That's beautiful, Timothy," I said, kneeling down to his level. "But what do you think we should do with it now?" He considered the question seriously, his little face scrunched in concentration. "Let it go," he suggested. "That sounds like a good idea," I agreed. "Beautiful things deserve to be free, don't you think?" As we watched the butterfly flutter away toward the wildflower meadow, I thought about freedom and captivity, about the difference between love that traps and love that liberates. Timothy would grow up understanding that families can be complicated, that adults sometimes make mistakes, but that honesty and forgiveness can create something beautiful, even from the wreckage of deception. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life we'd chosen to build together from the fragments of what had come before. And somehow, that made it more precious than any fantasy could have been.